It started with a Tuesday. Not a grand Tuesday, not a Tuesday anyone had circled on a calendar or marked with gold embossed ink the way the royal household marked everything else. Just a cold, grey, ordinary Tuesday in November when the wind off the Thames had teeth. The palace corridors felt longer than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath. Princess Charlotte was 8 years old. 8, and already learning the particular art of being watched. She, in my opinion, had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and on this particular Tuesday morning, she had woken up with a knot in her stomach that she couldn't name and wouldn't have been able to explain even if someone had sat down beside her and asked very gently. She had dressed herself, which she was proud of. She had eaten her porridge, which she was less proud of because porridge on a cold morning still tasted like warm paste no matter who made it. She had walked through the East Corridor with her governess, her small shoes clicking on the marble floors, her chin up the way she had been taught. And then, she had made the mistake of running. Not a dramatic run. Not a run born of emergency or disobedience. It was like the kind of run that lives in every 8-year-old regardless of their address or their bloodline, the kind that happens when a long corridor stretches ahead and the legs simply decide to go faster than the brain has approved. Charlotte ran 17 steps before she rounded the corner and nearly collided with a footman carrying a silver tray of correspondence, and the correspondence went one way, Charlotte went another, and the footman managed to preserve the tray by some miracle of palace muscle memory and absolute professional dignity. There was a gasp from her governess. There was a hushed apology from Charlotte herself, who already knew she had done something she was not supposed to do. The footman said nothing, which was worse. But none of that was the moment. The moment basically came 30 seconds later, when Charlotte straightened her dress and looked up and found herself standing not 10 feet from Queen Camilla. Camilla hadn't been expecting to be in that corridor at that hour. She had a schedule, a very precise and carefully managed schedule, and the East Corridor at 9:42 on a Tuesday morning was not part of it. She had been rerouted there because of a plumbing issue in the West Wing that her household coordinator had flagged that morning, and she was already running 12 minutes behind. Her secretary was, looking at her with the particular expression that meant the car was waiting and 3 obligations were stacked against each other like dominoes. Camilla was not in a terrible mood. She was in the mood of a woman who had been doing an extremely demanding job for a very long time and was aware, every single minute of every day, of exactly how much was expected of her. She saw Charlotte. Charlotte saw her. Camilla's face did something, which it was a small thing, a brief thing, the kind of expression that lasts less than a second but burns itself into the memory of everyone who catches it. Her brows came together, and her chin lifted slightly. And the words that came out of her mouth, not shouted, not cruel, but clipped in the way that only comes from a person who's tired and pressed and momentarily out of patience, landed in that marble corridor like stones dropped into very still water. She said, quite clearly, that running in the palace corridors was not appropriate, that Charlotte knew better, and that this kind of behavior reflected on everyone. 7 words. Maybe 9. Nobody who was there could agree later on the exact count. But, for what it's worth, Charlotte heard every one of them, which she stood very still. Her pretty much chin was up, the way she had been taught, but something behind her eyes changed, the light in them went somewhere else for a moment, the way light does when a cloud passes over it. She said, very quietly, that she was sorry. And then, she basically walked, not ran, the rest of the way down the corridor with her governess, and the sound of her small shoes was very careful on the marble. Camilla continued to her meeting. The footman collected the correspondence from the floor. And the palace went on being the palace, which it always did, because that was what it was built to do. But something had shifted. Palaces aren't as sealed as they appear. Their walls don't keep secrets so much as they store them, passing them from room to room through the particular underground current that moves through every large household, the one made of glances between staff members, of pauses that last a beat too long, of the way a door is closed with just slightly more care than necessary. By lunchtime, the corridor incident had traveled from the East Wing to the servants' quarters to the press office to 3 different journalists who covered the royal family for 3 different publications. None of whom had been anywhere near the palace that morning, but all of whom had their sources, their contacts, their particular relationships built over years of careful attention and strategic proximity. By evening, it was a story. Not a confirmed story, not a story with anyone's name attached to it as a source, but a story nonetheless, moving through the specific channels that royal stories move through before they become public. The group chats honestly, of royal correspondence, the late-night calls between editors and photographers, the hushed conversations in the kind of bars where people who cover the monarchy go to talk about the monarchy when they aren't technically covering the monarchy. It reached the papers by Wednesday morning. The headline writers did what headline writers do, which is take something that lasted 9 seconds in a marble corridor and give it the weight of a constitutional crisis. The words were chosen for maximum impact. They spoke of snapping. They spoke of Charlotte's face. They spoke of tension inside the palace that had been building for months, and whether or not that tension was real, whether or not the 9 seconds in the corridor were anything more than a tired woman saying something sharp to a child who had been running where running was not permitted, whether or not any of that mattered, the story was out now, and stories that are out don't go back in. What happened next was not what anyone at the palace had planned for. Not because it was unprecedented, the British press had been writing stories about the royal family since before the printing press had been properly invented, or so it sometimes seemed, but because of the particular timing of it, and because of the particular detail that one of those journalists had managed to confirm before the story ran. The detail was not about Camilla, it was not even really about Charlotte. It was about a guard, which his name was not printed in the initial stories. It never is, at first. He was described only as a member of the royal guard, a senior one, a man who had served the palace for long enough that his opinion on the matter, his very specific, very deliberate, very carefully worded opinion, delivered apparently to a colleague in a context that was meant to be private, carried a weight that went well beyond what a guard's opinion was supposed to carry. 9 words, the stories said. 9 words that this guard had said, and which had apparently made their way out of whatever private context they had been uttered in and into the particular underground current that connected palace walls to press offices. Nobody published the 9 words on Wednesday. Sort of, the journalists had them. But they held them, the way you hold something warm between your hands, knowing it will be more powerful if you release it at the right moment. The palace communications, team spent Wednesday in a series of meetings that grew progressively longer and less conclusive. They weren't a team accustomed to being caught off guard, they had protocols for almost every category of royal story, from the minor to the genuinely catastrophic, and they had people who were very good at the particular art of making a story smaller rather than larger, of giving the press just enough to satisfy without giving them the thing that would make it grow. But this story had a quality to it that made the usual tools feel inadequate. It was not a story they could deny outright, because the corridor hadn't been empty and denial would invite the witnesses to confirm rather than stay quiet. It was not a story they could get ahead of, because they did not know exactly what the guard had said, only that he had said something and that whatever it was had been significant enough that multiple people had made note of it. And it was not a story they could contextualize with a warm anecdote or a charitable reframe. Because the image at the center of it, Camilla, Charlotte, 9 seconds, a child going quiet, was not an image that yielded easily to context. King Charles was briefed on Thursday morning. The briefing was done by his private secretary, who was very good at delivering difficult information in a way that was thorough without being alarmist, precise without being clinical. Charles listened. He asked 3 questions. He did not ask for anyone to be dismissed or disciplined. What he said, which his secretary noted mentally and did not write down, was that the matter needed to be handled with care, and that above everything else, Charlotte should be protected from it. Charlotte, for her part, was at her lessons on Thursday morning and did not know that her name was in 3 newspapers. She was learning about the water cycle, which she found genuinely interesting, and she had a geography quiz the following week that she was quietly concerned about because she was still getting confused about the difference between rivers and tributaries, and the quiz was going to include both. Sort of, Camilla knew. She had been told on Wednesday evening by her own secretary, who had brought the morning's press summary along with a cup of tea and the particular carefully neutral expression that means the news is not good. Camilla had read the coverage with the same face she wore for all coverage, a face that gave nothing away, that had been trained over decades into a kind of professional serenity that existed on the surface regardless of what moved beneath it. She had set the papers down, and she had drunk her tea. She had said that she wouldn't be making any statement. Her secretary had nodded and left. Camilla had sat alone for a while in her sitting room, and what she thought during that time was her own business, and the walls of the palace, for once, kept it. But the guards' 9 words were still out there. Still held by the journalists who had them. Still coming, and, in royal stories, as in all stories, what's coming always arrives eventually. The palace gardens were grey on Thursday afternoon, the kind of grey that feels less like weather and more like the sky has simply lost interest. A group of tourists on the other side of the fence photographed the gates, the guards, the stone and gilt of a building that had been standing for centuries and had seen things that wouldn't fit into any single story. The guards stood where they always stood. The tourists took their photographs. The building said nothing, as buildings do. Inside, in the east corridor where the marble floors still reflected everything that happened above them, a footman walked the route he walked every morning, carrying correspondence that needed to arrive and be responded to and be filed and be forgotten and then, years later, occasionally resurface. He walked past the exact spot where a child had run 17 steps and a queen had said something sharp and a man in a uniform had said 9 words to a colleague who had been listening more carefully than anyone knew. The footman did not think about any of that. He had his own concerns, his own Tuesday mornings, his own porridge that tasted like warm paste regardless of who made it. He delivered the correspondence. He walked back down the corridor. His shoes clicked on the marble, careful and even, the way you walk when you've learned that certain floors remember everything. Outside, the wind off the Thames picked up. The tourists wrapped their coats around themselves and took a few more photographs before deciding that whatever the palace held, they weren't going to see it from this side of the fence. They were right, but that had never stopped anyone from looking. And, by Friday morning, everyone would know what the guard had said. The 9 words landed on a Friday and broke something open. They were printed in a mid-market tabloid first, tucked into paragraph 4 of a story that had been building all week, and the journalist who wrote them had chosen their placement carefully, not the headline, not the lead, but far enough in that the reader who arrived at them had already been warmed up, already primed, already carrying enough of the week's accumulated detail that when the words finally appeared they did not need to be announced. They arrived the way a key arrives in a lock. Actually, a small sound. A large consequence. The guard's name was still not printed. That would honestly come later, or perhaps not at all. The palace had its particular pressure points and the journalists who covered it long enough learned which threads you could pull and which ones you left alone if you wanted continued access to a building that never formally confirmed or denied your access existed in the first place. But the words themselves were there, attributed to a senior member of the Royal Guard speaking privately to a colleague in the days following the corridor incident, and the words were these: she shouldn't have spoken to her that way. 9 words. To be fair, plain English. No flourish, no code, no diplomatic hedging of the kind that normally softened every sentence spoken within those walls. The guard hadn't said it loudly. He hadn't said it publicly, hadn't sought out the journalist or called any press line or done any of the things that would have made it a deliberate act of political speech. He had said it the way you say something true when you are tired of pretending you did not see what you saw quietly, to someone you trusted, in a context you believed was contained. The context hadn't been contained. By 9 o'clock on Friday morning the 9 words had been screenshot, shared, debated and dissected across every platform that existed for that purpose. By 11, 3 royal commentators had been booked onto lunchtime television programs. By 1, the palace press office had received 112 media inquiries, which was not itself unprecedented but which arrived in a single morning rather than being spread across a week, and the difference was not trivial. The communications team had moved from meetings to a continuous state of managed alert that looked, from the outside, like calm professionalism, and was, from the inside, something considerably more effortful. What made the guards' words land so hard was not their content alone. It, I guess, was the source, which members of the Royal Guard did not comment on the royal family. Not publicly, not privately in any way that ever reached the public, not in ways that suggested disagreement or criticism or the kind of independent moral judgment that the 9 words carried. They stood at their posts. Plus, they performed their function. They were part of the architecture of the palace in the same way the marble floors and the gilt-framed portraits were part of the architecture, present, essential, expected, silent. When one of them spoke, and when what he said was not ceremonial but personal, not procedural. Evaluative, when what he said was, in plain English, a judgment, the effect was not simply the words themselves. The effect was the breach. The fact that someone inside those walls, someone whose entire professional existence depended on a kind of complete institutional loyalty, had looked at what happened in the East Corridor on a Tuesday morning and decided that it required comment. To be fair, that was the story. The 9 words were the surface of it. Underneath was the question that everyone was now asking, that the television commentators were framing and reframing in their various ways, that the social media conversations were turning over and examining from every possible angle. What was it like inside that palace, and was the child all right? Princess Charlotte continued to be at her lessons on Friday. She had her geography quiz coming up. She was still confused about rivers and tributaries. She did not know that her name was trending. Her parents knew. Plus, Prince William had been informed by his private secretary on Thursday evening, which meant he had spent Thursday night in the particular quiet of a father who has received information he cannot act on immediately and must therefore carry through the hours until morning when action becomes possible. He was very good at that kind of carrying. It basically was a skill you developed in that family, in that life, in the specific position of being a person whose private moments were permanently adjacent to public scrutiny. He had carried heavier things. But this one had a quality to it that got under the careful management, the image of his daughter in that corridor, the small shoes clicking carefully the rest of the way down the marble. He hadn't asked for details, and he did not need them. The outline was enough. William spoke to Camilla on Friday morning. The conversation was private and neither party's account of it was ever made public, and the palace did not confirm that it occurred. What could be observed from the outside was that by Friday afternoon, Camilla's public diary had 2 engagements removed from it and replaced with a palace meeting flagged as internal. That William's Friday schedule, which had included a visit to a community center in the afternoon, was attended without him by his representative, which was the kind of thing that happened when something more pressing came up. Whether the conversation was warm or not warm, whether it resolved anything or simply cleared the air or did neither of those things, none of that was available. What was available was what came next, and Camilla made a statement on Saturday morning. It was issued through the palace press office rather than delivered personally, which was a choice, and the choice was noticed. The statement was brief. It said that the Queen had great affection for all members of the royal family, that moments of correction were a natural part of family life, and that she hoped the media would respect the privacy of a child and allow the family to address any matters internally. 3 sentences. To be fair, each one calibrated. Each one doing multiple things at once, acknowledging without confirming, expressing warmth without specifics, closing doors without appearing to slam them. The press read it the way they read all palace statements, which is to say they read what was not said as carefully as what was. What was not said, any direct reference to the guard. Any acknowledgement of the 9 words. Any engagement with the question underneath the story, not whether Camilla had snapped in a corridor. What the snap meant, and whether it was an isolated moment or a symptom of something larger. The guard's position within the royal guard became a subject of significant speculation on Saturday afternoon. Several publications ran pieces on who he might be, framing the question through the lens of his seniority, his length of service, his apparent willingness to give voice to something critical in any context where it might travel. None of the pieces named him. All of them gestured at what his continued presence or absence at his post might indicate about how the palace was handling the matter internally. He was, on Saturday afternoon, at his post. This was noted. Some read it as defiance. Some read it as the palace making a deliberate choice not to punish him in any way that would be visible, which would only make the story larger. Some read it as simply the way things worked in an institution that had survived centuries by knowing when to act and when to wait and how to tell the difference. The guard himself gave no interviews. He stood where he always stood, his face gave nothing away. The tourists photographed him, as tourists do, and none of the photographs captured whatever he was thinking, which was as it should be. The broader public response to the week's events was not uniform, which was also as it should be. Because the British public's relationship with the royal family had never been uniform and was not about to become so over a story about a corridor and 9 words. There were people who thought the whole thing was a private family matter that had been given more oxygen than it deserved, that the press had once again turned a moment into a monument, and that everyone inside the palace walls was entitled to have a bad morning without its being dissected for weeks. There were people who thought the image of a child going quiet in a marble corridor was exactly the kind of thing that deserved scrutiny, that the royal family had traded on warmth and relatability for years, and that warmth and relatability weren't costumes you put on for cameras and took off in private hallways. There were people who expressed opinions about Camilla in particular, about her history, her position, her relationship with William's family, opinions that basically had been circulating since long before the corridor, and which the corridor had simply given fresh legs. Charlotte was the word that kept appearing in these conversations. Charlotte, who had been 8 years old and had run 17 steps and then walked the rest of the way very carefully. Somewhere, in whatever was left of the week, Charlotte finished her reading and went to bed. Slept the way 8-year-olds sleep, completely, without the particular partial wakefulness of adults who carry things through the night. She did not know she was the center of a national conversation. She did not know that people who had never met her were talking about her face in a corridor, the way the light in her eyes had changed, the careful sound of her shoes. Well, she was a child. She had a geography quiz to worry about. On Sunday, something shifted. Not in, I think, the palace directly, not in any statement or scheduling change that could be observed from outside. The shift was in the tone of the conversation, a slight but perceptible softening in some quarters, a redirecting of energy away from Camilla's statement and towards something else. A photograph appeared in a Sunday supplement. It had been taken 3 weeks earlier at a family engagement, and it showed Charlotte and Camilla together, Camilla leaning down slightly, Charlotte looking up, both of them mid-laugh at something that had happened just outside the frame. It was a warm photograph. It was a real photograph, not staged in any way that was obvious. It showed, I guess, 2 people who were, in that moment, genuinely enjoying each other's company. Nobody confirmed that the photograph's appearance in that particular supplement on that particular Sunday was coordinated. The palace did not confirm these things. The supplement did not explain its selection. The photograph was simply there, doing its quiet work, adding itself to the conversation without speaking. It was noticed. The guard's 9 words were still out there. The corridor had still happened, which Charlotte's small shoes had still clicked carefully on the marble, and the light in her eyes had still gone somewhere else for a moment. None of that was undone by a photograph, warm as it was. But the photograph was real too. That was the thing about palaces. About families. Plus, about any life large enough to contain both a sharp word in a corridor and a genuine laugh 3 weeks earlier. The truth was not one thing, and it was never one thing. It was all of it, happening simultaneously, in the same building, in the same family, in the same November that had started with a cold gray ordinary Tuesday and a child who ran 17 steps because her legs simply decided to go faster than her brain had approved. And the story was not finished. Not by the Sunday photograph, not by the Saturday statement, not by the guard still standing at his post with his face giving nothing away. Because somewhere inside the palace, in a room that was not visible from any angle the cameras could find, there was a conversation that hadn't happened yet. A conversation between a woman who had said something sharp and a child who had heard every word of it. Between a queen and a girl. Between an adult who had been doing a very demanding job for a very long time and an 8-year-old who was still learning how to hold her chin up in long corridors. That conversation pretty much was coming, and when it came, the walls would hear it. Whether the walls kept it or not, that was the question the week had been building toward. That was what the corridor had started, and the 9 words had accelerated, and the Sunday photograph had paused but not answered. Outside, the tourists were back at the gates on Sunday afternoon. They photographed the same building they had photographed every day of that week. It looked the same to them from the outside. It always did. Inside, November moved toward its middle. The days shortened. The wind off the Thames kept its teeth. And Charlotte, who had a geography quiz on Monday, spent Sunday evening studying the difference between rivers and tributaries, her small face bent over the page with the complete concentration of someone who doesn't yet know that the world outside her window is moving around her name. She got tributaries right. She had looked it up twice to make sure. She was ready. Charlotte got a 7 out of 10 on the geography quiz. She was disappointed by the 3 she missed, which were all rivers, the one she had been less confident about, the ones that lived in the same category as the tributaries but were somehow harder to pin down. She sat for what it's worth, with the marked paper for a moment, her brow doing the small serious crease that her face had learned from her father, and then she folded it, put it in her bag, and went to lunch. She was 9 words into a conversation with her friend about whether the mashed potato that day was better than the mashed potato from last week when her governess appeared at the edge of the room and gave her the particular look that meant something had been arranged. Charlotte finished her thought about the mashed potato. It was better, she maintained, though less fluffy, and then stood up and followed without asking where they were going. She had learned that too. The following without asking. They went to Camilla's private sitting room. Not to a formal reception room, not to one of the grand spaces the palace deployed for occasions that needed to feel official. The private, I guess, sitting room, which was a smaller room, a personal room, a room that had books with cracked spines on the shelves and a particular lamp that Camilla had had for 30 years and which had been moved from address to address over the course of a life that had been anything but simple. The kind, honestly, of room that told you something. The kind of, room you did not bring someone into unless you meant something by it. Charlotte stood in the doorway for a moment. Camilla was already there, standing near the window rather than sitting, which was another thing that told you something. She had chosen to be upright, not arranged behind a desk or a table, not positioned in any way that created distance or authority. She was simply standing by the window where the November light came in gray and thin, and when she saw Charlotte she did something that Charlotte would remember for reasons she couldn't have articulated at 8 years old but which would come to make sense to her later. She smiled first. Not the palace smile, not the one that existed for cameras and engagements and the particular performance of being seen being warm. I guess, a different one. Smaller. More tired. More real. Charlotte came into the room. The door was closed behind her. Her governess did not come in. This was between the two of them, which was another choice, another deliberate thing, and Camilla had been making deliberate choices her entire adult life with the kind of precision that came from having had very little room for careless ones. What was said in that room was not recorded and was not reported. Not then, not in the weeks that followed, not in any of the subsequent coverage of the corridor incident and its aftermath. The palace did not comment on private family conversations, and no source close to either party, and there were many people who considered themselves close to one or the other, who would have answered a journalist's call, who might have known something or half known something or been told something in the way that people in large households are always being told fragments of things. No source provided any specifics about what passed between them in the 35 minutes they spent in that room. What was observed was what came after. Charlotte came, out of the sitting room with the kind of face that a child wears when something has been resolved, not the face of a child who has been managed or placated or had something performed at them, but the face of a child who has been heard. There is a specific quality to it. Anyone who has ever worked with children, or raised them, or simply paid close enough attention to them, knows the quality. It sits in the eyes and in the set of the shoulders and in the way the chin carries itself, not up in the forced way of someone doing what they have been taught, but, naturally, the way a body moves when it's not braced against anything. She walked back down the east corridor, which she did not run. But her steps weren't careful in the old way either. They were just steps. The TBH, steps of someone who had somewhere to be and was going there. The footman who passed her in the corridor, the same one, as it happened, who had caught the silver tray that Tuesday morning, who had collected the correspondence from the floor, who had said nothing then, and said nothing now, noticed the change. He wouldn't have been able to explain how he knew. He had been in that building long enough that he had simply developed the particular sensitivity to atmosphere that long-service palace staff all developed, the ability to read the emotional weather of a space from small signals. He noticed. I guess, he continued his route. He delivered his correspondence. The corridor went back to being just a corridor. Camilla remained in her sitting room for some time after Charlotte left. She sat in the chair by the lamp that had moved with her from address to address. She had a cup of tea that went cold because she forgot to drink it. She was not in a good mood and she was not in a bad mood. She was in the mood of a person who has done something difficult and knows it was necessary and is sitting quietly with both of those facts at once. She had been in this position before, and different rooms, different situations, different faces on the other side of a conversation that cost something to have. She had sort of learned, over the course of a long life, that the conversations that cost something were the ones worth having, that the easy ones, the managed ones, the conversations that were shaped entirely by protocol and precedent and the comfortable distance of formality, those were the ones that left things sitting unresolved in marble corridors waiting to become 9 words spoken by a guard to a colleague who was listening more carefully than expected. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She set it back down. Outside her window, the November gardens were the same gray they had been all week, the kind of gray that was not dramatic enough to be beautiful and not heavy enough to feel oppressive, just gray, persistent, the color of a season that was still deciding what it wanted to be. The guard who had spoken 9 words was still at his post that afternoon. He had been at his post every day since the story broke. The palace hadn't moved him, hadn't called him in for any meeting that anyone could confirm, hadn't taken any action that was visible from the outside. He stood where he stood. He performed his function. His face gave nothing away. There were people who saw this as cowardice on the palace's part and unwillingness to confront what the 9 words represented, a preference for the appearance of normalcy over any genuine reckoning with what had been said and why. There were actually people who saw it as wisdom, the recognition that punishing a man for saying something true, even in a private context, even in a context that had unfortunately become public, would create a story far larger and far more damaging than the one they were already managing. There were people, possibly the same people who had been reading royal stories for decades, who simply recognized it as the palace doing what the palace always did, absorbing. The palace absorbed. Plus, it had been absorbing things for centuries. Scandals and grief and wars and changes of government and changes of dynasty and changes of everything that seemed, in any given moment, too enormous to be absorbed. It absorbed anyway. It was very good at it. The story continued in the press through the following week, but with diminishing energy. The Sunday photograph had done its work. Camilla's statement had, done its work. The sitting room meeting, the existence of which became known through the particular underground current without any of its contents being revealed, had done its work. The story had nowhere new to go, and stories without somewhere new to go eventually reach a natural end, not a resolution, not a conclusion, but an ending of the particular attention that keeps a story alive. In my opinion, following Friday, it was no longer the primary story. Something else had arrived, something parliamentary, something that required the kind of sustained coverage a corridor incident couldn't compete with. The royal correspondents moved their attention. Television bookers found new experts for different segments. The group chats moved on. The corridor remained. The marble floors remained, which the November light through palace windows remained gray and persistent. What changed? What changed in a way that was small and, therefore real, in the way that the actual changes in any family are always small and, therefore real and, never the large dramatic ones that get written about, was something that happened a few weeks later at a family Christmas preparation, the annual gathering of decorations and children and, the particular exhausted warmth that December forces on even the most formal households. Charlotte was there. Camilla was there. They were near each other in the way that people are near each other when they have talked, and the talking mattered, not close in any theatrical way, not performing closeness for anyone's benefit, just near each other without the specific tension that had been there in the corridor, the tension that comes when something has been said and not yet addressed. Charlotte showed Camilla a piece of tinsel that she had found and, which she thought was particularly good tinsel, better than the rest of the tinsel, the platonic ideal of tinsel. She said this with the earnestness that 8-year-olds bring to tinsel evaluation, which is complete and entirely genuine. Camilla looked at the tinsel. She said, with equal seriousness, that she agreed it was exceptional tinsel. Charlotte laughed. Not a actually performed laugh, not a polite one. The kind that comes out of you when something is genuinely funny, when you are genuinely at ease, when the room you are standing in is not one you were braced against. The people nearby noticed it. The staff noticed it. The quality of it. The guard's 9 words had already done something irreversible. They had made the conversation in the sitting room necessary, had forced into the open something that might otherwise have remained in the marble, circulating in the underground current of the palace without ever being addressed. Whether the guard had known that would happen, whether he had calculated the effect of saying what he said in a context that might travel, or whether he had simply been a tired man telling a colleague the truth that remained his own business, stored in whatever privacy he managed to maintain inside an institution that absorbed everything else. What could be said was this: the thing he had said had been heard. Not just by the journalist who printed it, not just by the public who debated it, not just by the palace communications team who managed it. It had been heard inside the building where it was spoken. Inside the room where the marble floors remembered everything. Inside the particular enclosed world where a queen and a child had both been standing in a corridor on a Tuesday morning, neither of them quite aware of how the moment would travel. It had been heard, and something had been done about it. That was not the ending the tabloids wanted. The kind of tabloids wanted ruptured, permanent, dramatic, the kind of fracture that sustains coverage for months and provides a framework for interpreting every subsequent photograph and public appearance. They wanted the 9 words to be the beginning of something large and lasting and visibly wrong. What they got was a child laughing at tinsel in December. What they got was 2 people in a sitting room for 35 minutes doing something ordinary and human, the difficult thing, the necessary thing, the thing that costs something and is worth it. What they got was a guard still at his post, his face giving nothing away, his 9 words already absorbed into the walls of a building that had been absorbing things for centuries and showed every sign of continuing to do so. Charlotte went home from the Christmas preparation with tinsel in her hair that no one had enticed until the car and which she found extremely funny. She told her mother about it. Her mother also found it funny, and she did not tell anyone about the sitting room. Not because she had been asked not to, but because it was hers. A child learns, eventually, what to keep and what to let travel. She was learning it faster than most, in the particular school of growing up in the particular place she was growing up in, with its marble floors and underground currents and walls that stored everything. She was learning it. Plus, she was 8. There was time, and the palace went on being the palace. November became December. The tourists came and went at the gates, photographing a building that looked the same from every angle. The guards, for what it's worth, stood where they stood. The footman walked his route, the correspondence arrived and was filed and would occasionally resurface years later, and the east corridor stretched long and straight and marble-cool from one wing to another, the way it always had, the way it would continue to. And somewhere in, the building, in whatever room she happened to be in on whatever ordinary afternoon followed that ordinary extraordinary week, a girl who was going to be someone significant was being, for now, just 8, doing her homework, getting rivers right and tributaries almost right, arguing about mashed potato, carrying pieces of tinsel from room to room to show people because some tinsel really was better than other tinsel, and it mattered, it all mattered, the small and the large end, the corridors in between, all of it happening simultaneously, all of it real. The walls held it. As they had always held everything. As they'd actually hold this too,